Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 123, the EZ-D6 system. So, I know we've covered a lot of game systems over the history of this show, and 99% of the time our information comes from various sources around the internet, as I tend to not have copies of those systems on hand, and let's be honest here, we don't necessarily have the money to go out and buy all those books. This week's topic, however, came from a conversation I had with Jim, who's one of my best friends on planet Earth, as well as one of the players in my Fallout game right now. He had picked up a copy of the EZ-D6 book. He let me look over it, and I was so intrigued by it that I did decide to go get one of my own. Now, I know we covered the last system we covered on this show off the text itself, so even though we usually don't have the resources to go off of, we've gotten lucky these last two times. So anyway, with all of that, let me grab my copy of the EZ-D6 system and crank up the tour bus as we break this new system down. EZ-D6, and let me spell that for you, because it's EZ-D6. It's the brainchild of Scotty McFarlane, who many of you might know as DM Scotty on YouTube. Sean Bova handles the artwork for the release, and it was dropped in 2022 through Runehammer Games. And since I do like to discuss the size of these books, it checks in at 116 pages. But let's just be real, size doesn't matter. I just want to get that out there up front. McFarlane explains in the introduction to the book what his inspiration was for creating the system, and he notes that he wanted, quote, a game that dropped all the in-game mechanical distractions, yet had enough rules to arbitrate a great story created by everyone at the table. You know, the good stuff, end quote. He also notes a few things to keep in mind as you work your way through learning the system. It centers on role-playing. The GM figure is known as the rabble-rouser, and the players will be the pushers and shovers. Okay, so typically when we cover game systems, one of the very first things we cover is how to figure out what the attributes and skills for the player are, as those determine what dice and or how many of them need to be rolled. Well, EZ-D6 is a lot different, as all rolls in the game are determined by how difficult the rabble-rouser feels they'll be, and they're rated on a scale of 2 to 6. That's because rolling a 1 on a d6 in this game is always a failure. So with 1s out of the way, let's break down the other 5 ranks, and our chart is specific to combat. 2s are easy tasks, and the text suggests things like weak or slow enemies. 3s are normal, and those would be your normal type enemies. 4s, those are hard. Those are a little tougher or a little faster. 5s are very hard. Those are your kind of elite or exceptionally fast folks. 6s, those are super hard. Those are the creme de la creme of enemies, i.e. your big bad evil guy. Now, the overall thought is that the majority of your combat situations will be a 3, which requires a 3 or higher on your d6 roll to hit. Now, of course, the rabble-rouser can adjust that however they'd like, and it's noted that it can change multiple times in the same combat based on how the action's going. That's the basics of combat. I mean, hell, that's pretty much everything concerning combat, at least from a mechanics point. Let's talk skills. EZ-D6 takes those out of the equation, like I said a moment ago, and it replaces them with what they call the boon. For all intents and purposes, the boon is something the rabble-rouser can grant the hero, and typically they'll grant it for something the hero has some training in. What is the boon? Another d6 to roll for the task without increasing the difficulty. And as the text points out, it's easier to beat a 5 with 2 dice instead of 1. Now, as we've seen more than once, where you get a boon, there has to be a bane. This would be for those situations that are, well, let's call them impossible for the hero to control. Extreme darkness, shitty weather, you get the point. The Bane also grants the hero another d6, but this time the lower of the 2 rolls is kept and counted. And if you're in a situation where the hero would have a boon from training but a bane from the situation, those cancel each other out and only 1 d6 would be rolled. I mean, it's pretty simple. The option also exists for another player to help the one doing the task. They have to give up their action for the turn, but they can also roll a d6. And much like the boon situation, the best of the dice rolled is used. We also noted that 1s always fail, but I also need to add that 6s always succeed. Now, obviously, the players need to figure out what happens when these things occur, whether it's positive or negative, and the rabble-rouser is encouraged to follow the rule of cool when working with the players to describe it. There's a couple of more things in the rules that allow for some help for the players, and the first we'll look at is the hero die. Each player gets one of these at the start of every session. It's a D6, and the players can burn it at any time to re-roll a die. And that works even if it rolled a 1, which, if we're being honest, is probably the roll we'd be holding the die for in the first place. I mean, come on. Karma is the other thing that can help a player out. 3 karma are given to the player at the start of the session and can also be rewarded during the session for excellent role-playing moments. Oh, and failure guarantees you get a point of karma. Every failed action roll, in fact, grants you a karma. Of course, you can only get 1 karma per turn, so even if you fail 3 rolls, you only get 1 karma. Anyway, I just discussed what karma is. How about telling you how it's used? You can burn a karma to improve nearly any die roll by 1 pip per karma burned. In other words, if you need a 5, but you rolled a 4, you can burn a pip to make that roll a 5 and therefore a success. If by chance you improve a roll to a 6, you get the benefits of having rolled a 6 naturally. Now, karma cannot be used on magics or miracles, and we're going to discuss what those are a little later on. Now, we're talking about actions and rolls, and I've mentioned turn a time or two, so why don't we knock out the concept of time in the easy D6 system? There are 2 states of gameplay, and therefore 2 measures of time: narrative time and action time. And while these should be pretty self-explanatory, we probably really ought to define those anyway. Narrative time is what Scotty calls a loose time structure. In other words, it could stretch from days to weeks to months, whatever is needed for the game at that time. This is where discussions of plans or goals or whatever needs to take place takes place between the players. And it's up to the rabble-rouser to make sure everyone that wants to participate is allowed to. Action time? Well, now that's more solid. There's not a definite length of time for these, but when you consider that pretty much every game system out there considers a round or a turn to be 6 seconds, that's a pretty fair number for easy D6 if you were going to try to pinpoint one. During a single turn, each hero can move, do a turn action, and do a free action, and we'll break those down in a moment. The concept of the scene is also something we need to break down. It's used as the length of time for things like effect duration. As the text itself notes, quote, "It's often called an encounter in other games," end quote. So now we've got a reasonable frame of reference. It's also noted that if it's a non-combat situation, time it out to about 10 minutes. So to this point in the breakdown, I've been following the text section by section. Now that we're getting into breaking down what can be done during a turn, I'm going to skip around the sections so that we can better organize all of the thoughts in the order you need to know them in. And as an aside, if I have one complaint about the rulebook, it's that things are laid out in an order that isn't the most convenient for those of us who've played a lot of other games and systems. But if that's the only thing I have to bitch about, we're going to be just fine. Let's talk initiative. Well, not initiative in the sense of a score or a particular order. Easy D6 does away with that concept as we know it. Unless the group is surprised by whatever enemy they're taking on, all of the heroes will act first, with the enemy's actions happening after that. The order the heroes go in is entirely up to them, so hopefully your group can get along and make this work in an equitable way. The only thing the rabble-rouser has to do with this is to keep track of everyone to ensure all of the heroes and all of the enemies get their actions during the turn. We mentioned a moment ago that each hero can do 3 things during a turn: move, take a turn action, and take a free action. Let's break those down. Movement is limited to 30 feet or less. Well, unless their player chooses to have their character run, but we'll cover that in a minute. Those 30 feet can be shortened by the quality of the terrain, since it would be difficult to get that far on slick or icy surfaces, and having things like boulders and busted roads or floors would also play into it. It's also completely possible that the rabble-rouser determines that the distance is so far that it would take 2 turns or more to get there. But the rabble-rouser should be making that abundantly clear before the group makes their decisions, just to be fair. So what are the turn actions? I think we'll just list them out. Attack a target, cast a spell, use a scroll, disarm a trap, though that could be a multiple turn action, pick up a weapon, run or move further than you could in the movement part of the round, arm yourself with a shield, and any other action the rabble-rouser deems necessary that would fit into that category. Free actions are things like speaking to the enemy or others not affiliated with the party, taking a potion, drawing or sheathing your weapon, and any other actions that the rabble-rouser feels fit into that category. Overall, it's pretty simple and fairly self-explanatory, and it leaves a lot of room for the players and the rabble-rouser to improvise their own thoughts, wants, and needs. Now, since combat is something that's going to take place during these turns, we need to discuss it here. The 2 hit numbers have already been laid out, so we don't really need to repeat it here. What we do need to consider is damage. I mean, we've seen health points, hit points, armor points. You name it, we've seen it used for other games to this point. So what's the equivalent in Easy D6? 3 strikes. 1 hit equals 1 strike. So if you get hit by the enemy 3 times, you're down and out. Though I'd note down and out doesn't mean dead, just to be clear. And armor does help you a bit. If you're wearing armor, you can make what's called an armor save each time you get hit. The rabble-rouser will use the chart we talked about earlier. You'll roll the d6, and if you succeed, you don't lose the strike. But if something happens to you, like you're lit on fire or you're poisoned, a regular armor save's not quite enough. You're going to need to make what's called a miraculous save, and that's going to be a much higher difficulty than the armor save. And in the case of something that should cause immediate death, like being caught in an explosion, the best the miraculous save can do is keep you up, but with only 1 strike left. But let's be real, strikes can be healed. There are some special abilities that can do it, plus there's some magic that can do it as well. Eating a meal and resting for the night can do it as well, so the system actively encourages the group to make sure they're getting their rest on the regular. One more thing I wanted to cover here before we move on. A 6 in combat is a crit. It also gives the opportunity to do more than 1 strike of damage. If you roll a 6, you do what the text calls confirming the crit. That means you roll another d6. If that's a 6, you do it again. And so on until you don't roll a 6. You can use your karma on these as well, so just keep that in mind. So basically, if you roll enough crits in a go, you can take down just about anything. And if you drop the enemy and still have crit results left, you can transfer those strikes to a nearby enemy. In melee, it would be those immediately nearby, while if you're a ranged hero, you can transfer them to anybody within sight. Of course, what would combat be without magic? And in Easy D6, they put a K on the end of that magic, just to kind of give it an old world feeling, don't you think? Maybe it's just me. Anyway, there's also something called a miracle, or more to the point, miracles, so let's get both of these out right quick. First thing we need to point out is that casting magic and or calling miracles is its own sort of mini-game, and I took the mini-game line straight from the text, just so we're giving the credit where it's due. The rules are also different. To cast your magic, you explain what spell you want to cast to the rabble-rouser, who then decides if it's something that needs to be targeted at something, whether it has an area effect, or if it's something that would be beneficial to the group or other friendlies in the area. Obviously, that depends on the intent. It also allows the rabble-rouser to decide how many resistance dice need to be rolled. Needless to say, most of the enemies and monsters you'll run into in the Easy D6 system roll 1d6 to resist, but there are some who roll more dice because they're just that damn cool. If the spell targets the environment gets 1d6 for resistance. I know, that's weird, but that's how the system works. Oh, and the rabble-rouser can choose to give the environment more dice for their resistance if they so choose. Just a thing they get. So we've chosen the spell, we've prepped it, the rabble-rouser set the resistance. Now we need to power that baby up, and that's on the shoulders of the conjurer, which is what a mage or a magic user is called in this system. Power level ranges from 1d6 to 3d6, and we can look at this in a similar way to how we look at a boon. The more dice the conjurer has to roll, the greater the chance they can overcome the resistance. And only one of those dice has to beat the resistance roll, so that's why I say that. And the conjurer will know what they have to beat before they choose the power level. That comes with a benefit of its own, since if the highest resistance number is a 1, the spell is automatically cast. And in a case of a tie, the win goes to the player, much as it should. There is one thing that the conjurer needs to consider when choosing power levels and casting magics. If any power die they roll is a 1, the spell fails automatically, even if any of the other dice would succeed. There's a way to overcome this, but the text specifically reminds players that if the resistance number is a low 1, roll fewer dice. I mean, that makes sense to me, but there are those who tend to go with the no risk, no reward philosophy. I mentioned that there's a way for the conjurer to still be able to cast their spell if they get a 1 on their roll, and that involves using what's called spell burn. It's pretty simple. For each strike of damage the conjurer takes, a rolled 1 is ignored. That would mean there still has to be a successful die roll in play somewhere here. So if you only roll 1 die and you get a 1, I'd skip this step. One more note on this. Karma cannot be used here, but the hero dice can be used to reroll any single level power die, and that includes a 1. Whew. So we've discussed how to cast a spell. So what can you do with it? First things first, a conjurer can target up to 6 enemies with a single spell. Of course, they need to be fairly close in proximity to each other, and there's a little something added in. For each target over 1, a d6 is added to the resistance roll for the group as a whole. In other words, whether you aim the spell at 1 target or 6, 1 resistance roll is all that rolled. All for 1 and 1 for all, basically. The text also notes that there are some spells that don't just immediately go off. Those spells need to be maintained, and the process is known as anchoring. Unlike games like D&D, the conjurer can still take actions while they're anchoring the spell, but if they try to cast another spell, they take a strike, or they fall unconscious, the anchor is broken and the spell will fail. It should also be noted that some circles of sorcery require the conjurer to burn karma as well as anchor the spell. We'll get into circles of sorcery in a few. Now, I've mentioned more than once so far in this show that this system has some very fluid dynamics to it, and spells aren't any different. While some of the spells are pretty self-explanatory in what they can and cannot do, there are some spells, and if we're being honest, some spell uses, that will require the player to tell the rabble-rouser what they're trying to do, and for the two of them to work out how the various roles will work. The rules also allow for creating your own spells on the fly, but again, it's noted that if it takes that long to do it, don't be a putz. Choose a spell from the list, cast it, and move on. Spell scrolls exist in EZD6, and they can have spells from any of the circles of sorcery. As you'd expect from a magic system, once the spell is cast from the scroll, it leaves the scroll and cannot be cast again. Also, as you'd expect, the power level for the spell on said scroll is preset, and those are typically 2d6, though ones can be re-rolled. Potions exist as well, and those are free actions to use, but using a scroll is a turn action. Okay, miracles. Did I just hear a Culture Club song? It's kind of weird. Anyway, if your hero happens to be exceptionally religious, they can call on the assistance of the divine. Granted, there's not a great chance that patron's going to give enough of a damn to help, but there's always the chance. The player in question rolls 3d6, and the rabble-rouser will roll what's termed an aloofness roll for the deity. Those dice are determined by the rabble-rouser themselves. If the hero succeeds, the request should be answered. Now, when it comes to the aloofness roll, it's tied to the request itself. As the text itself notes, raising the dead would be a 6d6 roll, while speaking with the dead would probably be more of a 3d6. Also, rolling a 1 ends the miracle shot, though the hero can make an offering to the deity to re-roll those dice at the cost of a prayer and whatever they're offering. It's up to the rabble-rouser to decide if the offering is sufficient. Now, there are a few restrictions on miracles. You can't use them to harm others in any way, even indirectly, since there are some out there who will try to rules lawyer their way out of that shit. No karma can be used, though the hero die can be used for a reroll. Also, miracles can only be used once per situation, so no, well, his failed, so let me call up my deity. No. There aren't any miracles really laid out in the text. It's kind of up to the player to describe what they're looking to do and for the rabble-rouser to decide if it's something the gods would even consider. When they do, as I mentioned, the rabble-rouser decides how much aloofness dice to roll, and we go from there. And I know this kind of goes without saying, but the rabble-rouser has the final say in these situations when they make these types of decisions. So again, don't be a dick about it. All right, let's talk wealth. No, not wealth management. That's another show and not one that I do because I have no idea how to manage wealth because, you got to have it before you can manage it. Just saying. Rather than worrying about keeping track of coins or cash or whatever, Easy D6 uses wealth levels. You could put stuff out there if you wanted to, but since the idea of this system is to speed up play and get out the bookkeeping slog, why would you do something like that? Levels go like this. Pauper. These guys don't have enough to pay for anything most of the time. Wait a minute. That sounds like some of the guys I go out to eat with from time to time. Funny. Cash poor. You can get a hot meal and maybe some decent clothes, but you're certainly not eating at the best restaurants. Moderate. You have decent gear and probably a halfway okay place to stay. Wealthy. You probably own a horse. Good on you. Lordly wealth. Dude, you've got servants. Probably a mansion and a yacht. I am Elma J. Fudd, millionaire. Anyway, sorry. Kingly wealth. You can Scrooge McDuck that shit. Just saying. And YouTube it if you're curious what the hell I just meant. All right, so by this point, we're 20 pages in, and the rule book is just now getting into character creation. There's 6 steps. Choosing a hero path, choosing a species, choosing inclinations, creating 2 aspects, choosing your circle of sorcery if you're a conjurer, and choosing your equipment. We'll start with hero paths, and I'm not going to get into detail on these. I'm sure Scotty would appreciate it if I left something in here for you to find when you buy the book. Also, each hero path has entries for health, armor, and boon, as well as a couple of special things that only that path can do. The hero paths are Warrior, Warden, Delver, Brute, Rascal, Conjurer, Friar, Scald, and Beastmaster. And I have to say that the art for each of those paths is on point. Species time. Each species has a benefit that's specific to them. And again, I'm not listing all that stuff out. You can choose from human, elf, dwarf, halfling, and goblin. The next step is choosing inclinations. And while humans get 3 of these, the other species only get 2. There's 30 inclinations listed, and they range from things like alchemy to trap finding. I consider these to be a cross between feats and perks, if you're familiar with D&D and the Fallout role-playing game, and other games that use those concepts. Again, I'm not going to list them all out. Your aspect is next, and these are more like what your background would be, with a character trait or 2 maybe mixed in. And you know somebody who sleeps like a rock and tends to be stoic? Are you the charmer that loves the ladies and knows how to cook the dish that wins them over? It's stuff like that that's considered to be aspects, and every pusher and shover has 2 of them. These are great items for roleplay, and the rules allow for boons to be granted to roles based on those things. For our conjurer friends, the next step is to pick the circle of sorcery that they're a part of. There are 9 different circles, and each has its own special rules or items, so think very hard about what you want to do. Maybe read them over before you make that choice. Those circles are Arcane Bands, Blastmaster, Botanicalist, Elementalist, Illusionist, Necromancer, Seer, Shadow Weaver, and Shapeshifter. And damn, I got through all of those in one go. Good on me. Also, again, I'm not going to break down the specifics here, and I think you know why. Last up in character creation is getting that gear. Look, there's 2 ways to do it. They can either pick 1 item from each group, and I'll explain the groups in a moment, or you can have them roll 1d6 for each group and take the item from the roll. The armor they get is detailed in their hero path, so that's not something they'll be choosing here. Weapons are chosen based on the concept for the character, and since there isn't a weapon list, that's a discussion for the player to have with the rabble-rouser. So if we're not choosing weapons and we're not choosing armor, what the hell are we choosing here? There are 2 categories of gear, common and specialty, and each category has 4 groups in it. Each group has 6 items, so now the D6 roll should make some sense. Common gear is things like a backpack, water skin, whistle. You get the idea. Specialty gear would be the things that really tie into the character concept, like holy water, professional tools, and quill and ink. So, in my opinion, it's really in the best interest of the player to take their time and choose their equipment to fit the concept they have for their character. And that's the player section of the book. From here, there's a section devoted to the rabble-rouser, though it's only about a dozen pages long, and it's mostly Scotty's advice and suggestions about how to best use the rules that have been covered to that point. The monster section is next, and it's full of monsters from classic games, as well as Scotty's takes on a few unique monsters you can use to drop into your own game. They're not so much statted out as given descriptions and abilities not unlike those the hero paths give the heroes. Magic Treasures is the next section, and over its dozen pages, a variety of scrolls and other magic items are presented, along with the rules for their use. The very last section is one I'd like to see more rulebooks use. A variety of short lists and charts to not only reinforce the rules in short form, but also provide the rabble-rouser with ideas and options to throw into the game on the fly if need be. These are the types of things you'd need a GM screen to get, and they're instead provided for the cost of the book. The final pages of the book are blank character sheets, and I need to note that the character sheet for EZD6 is a single page on one side of the page. So that's the rule book for EZD6. Scotty also wrote up a book of short adventures to run using the system, and it's also available for purchase, so if you like what you see in the rule book, I recommend picking it up. So, where can you get it? As I said earlier, this is the one time I'm not going to tell you to head to your local game shop because the only place I found it is on drivethrurpg.com. It's available for sale there in both hardcover and PDF form, and I got the rulebook and adventure book in PDF form for $30. So if you want to try a new game system and don't want to spend a small fortune, this is definitely wallet friendly. So, check out EZD6 and let me know what you think. And with that, we've come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we're going to cover Heritage models and a few of their classic releases. In the meanwhile, check out our other fine podcast, Bad GM's Campaign Build Along. It's the show where we build an entire campaign for you for a game system, and this season we're building for the Fallout role-playing game. And I've had several listeners of that show tell me that while they don't play Fallout, and they don't intend to, they do use what we write on that show for their own post-apocalyptic game. Bad GM's Campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from Pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We are all over social media, so check out the info box for this show or check out our website, badgmproductions.net, to see where you can find us. Next week, we do a deep dive on Heritage models, and whether you remember them or not, I'll bet you good money a few of you OG gamers have played a few of their games. But that's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History.